So time to put the decals on now, and this is a set from Draw Decals, and we're about to have some real problems which we'll go into as we go. As you can see, me using a ruler here just to cut around the exact decal I want to use. Now these decals are printed on an overall carrier film. So after you've cut the decal out from the sheet, you actually have to go around each individual image and cut close to the design without going through the backing paper. Very, very light cut just to outline the design so that the spare decal comes away. Because if you don't, if you cut straight through the decal and the backing paper, you'll end up with a very large ridge on the carrier, on the varnish. So this was about the time where I was about to learn that these decals aren't great, if I'm honest. They you can see me there just lightly cutting through without going through the backing paper, just so the excess will come away without leaving a ridge. But these decals have a very thin coat of varnish, and then the ink is printed on top of that varnish, but there's no varnish sealing the decals in. So a couple of points in the next stages of applying the decals, I had some of this ink actually chip away and come away, including one entire L from the fuselage Delta logos from the underlying varnish. This was ultimately solved by using some microscale or superscale liquid decal film painted over the entire sheet. That sealed those inks in and really saved that aspect of it, if you like. I didn't have any further problems with designs actually coming away. The other thing was I'm using some setting solution here, but I would advise against using setting solutions with these decals, as they start to distort very, very quickly when you're trying to manipulate them. And being an airliner with large areas of decal, you will be doing quite a lot of manipulation. So I'd advise just using water to wet the surface of the model for when you're manipulating the decals, and then just using, you know, the standard cotton buds and stuff to get the moisture out from under the decal. I did apply some setting solutions or softening solutions over them, but there's another story there as well. And so yeah, it was just basically a case of working around the model. I tended to work a little section at a time, keeping designs apart from each other, you know what I mean? So if I applied a decal to the tail, I'd then apply a decal somewhere else on the model so that multiple decals didn't pile up in the same area and potentially lead to issues. These tail decals really started to highlight the issues, and the ink that these decals are printed with, or however they're printed, they call them digital silkscreen, but the inks for some of these colors are really, really thick, and absolutely did not respond to any of the setting or softening solutions I had in any way whatsoever. I just could not get them to respond, and that includes some of the really strong ones like Mark Fit Super Strong from Tamiya. Even slicing along the panel detail, it didn't help. And in addition to that, at some point, sort of a few days after applying the decals and after actually applying some coats of varnish, I ended up with bubbling of the decals, where I think the inks are so impervious to and so waterproof that anything building up underneath, an evaporator or anything, caused bubbling. And I know there was no liquid under there, because I did sort of pierce the decals to see if there was any liquid under there to come out, and there wasn't. They'd literally just bubbled in the air. You can see the Mark Fit Super Strong being used there, and some of the tail decals, where these tail images are really, really thick ink. And I also had some bubbling on these wing walkways here. I'm looking at it sort of a week later now as I record this, and it appears to have settled a little bit, but not completely. So this is where I started to lose a bit of mojo with this model, if I'm honest. It became more of a chore than an enjoyable process, just because the decals weren't going how I wanted them to go. So with all the decals on, I then applied 3 or 4 coats of GX113 gloss, UV cut gloss or super smooth gloss, with polishing in between with various grits of wet and dry. But it's just a case of varnish, polish, or varnish sand, I should say, varnishing and sanding. And I think, like I say, it was about 4 coats of this went on. But I have to say, the inks used for these decals are so thick that really I was fighting a losing battle trying to blend those decals in to the surrounding paintwork. They really didn't want to know. So yeah, a little stand there that I printed from, I think from Colts 3D. I got that one from, so I can hold the model while I'm spraying. Liberal coats, thinned maybe 60-70% thinner to 30% varnish. And then sanding, starting off with 2,500 grit wet and dry here. I leave it in a cup of water permanently, and that keeps the backing paper actually very soft, which makes it very easy to use. And obviously wet sanding rather than dry sanding helps to clear sludge and give a really efficient cutting motion with the wet and dry, which means you can do very gently but consistently to polish those varnishes in. I would have had to applied 10 or 15 coats of varnish to come anywhere near to properly blending those decals in, but I did smooth out as much as I could as I went. So yeah, I always keep a cup of water with various grits of wet and dry cut to size and left in it permanently for when I need to do this kind of sanding job. It's actually quite a shame I had the problem with the decals, because I'm sure you'll agree, looking at the actual the actual paint finish is fairly nice. I was pretty happy with the way the paint finish went. So as long as you've got a good coat of varnish over, you can wet sand these without too much trouble at all, without any risk of lifting the decals or anything, as long as they're all sealed in properly. And I recommend it because it really does, it will give you a much nicer finish. I see a lot of airliner models that don't have any finishing or polishing applied over past using gloss paint, and I find it so disappointing a lot of the time that the general paintwork is nice, but no attempt has been made to blend the paint scheme and markings in and together. Obviously a little bit of care required so you don't go through the varnish and start cutting into the paint. I've swapped here to some 3000 grit Trizact, which gives more of a, it definitely is abrasive, but it's a bit more of a polishing action than an actual sanding action, if that makes sense. So this is after, you know, another couple of coats of the gloss, and switch to the Trizact, and it just helps to finally smooth the surface. To give what I'm going to describe as the best finish I was able to under the circumstances, I'm afraid. Again, the Trizact used almost exclusively wet. It just helps clear the sanding residue out, and helps the cutting action of the abrasive, including the wings, as you can see here. So these wing decals are actually quite nicely bedded down at this point. It would only be a couple of days later that I went back and checked and found some bubbling, which again, like a week or so later when I'm recording this now, has settled down a bit but will never go away completely. And so with all that done, I started adding the final bits of the airframe, so the tailplanes there, and the engines and stuff, getting the undercarriage on. Because I had trouble with the varnish with blending the decals in, I ended up using a slightly more satin varnish for the final coat, which just, as you can see here, it's still giving it quite a glossy appearance, but it's not as high gloss as I would normally have one of my airliner models. It's worked quite well, I have to say, to hide the worst of the problems with the decals, but is still a frustrating and less than perfect solution. But that was some of there's a Chinese company called Sunin7. I get their stuff from AliExpress, and it's very much like Gianotti's or, you know, Mr. Colour, any of those sorts of lacquers. It works very much the same, and the varnishes perform very much the same. So I used a mixture of their gloss with about 25% matte in it, just to turn it into a slightly more satin finish, which again helps to hide decal edges more than a gloss finish where you really have to work on blending. So yeah, just popping on tailplanes and engines and things like that here, and then getting the undercarriage on as we kind of approach the end game. I also 3D printed aerials to go on the fuselage. The kit ones were covered in flash and stuff, so I designed in 3D printed replacements, which were just painted gloss white and popped into place with a bit of PVA. And here we see them just adding super glue into the engine pylon attachments. I have checked the fit of this before doing it, so that I know that they're going to be a good firm push fit into there. This is Loctite 495 CA super glue, which is incredible stuff, very expensive, but anybody who says all super glues are the same is not paying attention. Basically, you can buy pound shop stuff which will do a job, but nothing is going to be nearly as good as paying good money for good CA. Nice firm fitting of the engine pods there, the engine nacelles and the pylons. Gentle push into place. And just dealing with the undercarriage now and the undercarriage doors. They obviously needed touching in with paint after they were all glued in and together. The wheels that went on to the main wheels were 3D printed, were designed by myself and 3D printed. So that's the main wheels, the engine intake and fans, the SATCOM antenna, and the smaller antennas on the fuselage. You can see one just in front of the Delta logo there. Were all designed and 3D printed by myself for this model. And so that is it. I appreciate that we've finished here before showing you the final assembly parts. So this is just an overall view of the final model on a turntable. As I said, I ran out of mojo because of the extreme problems I was having with the decals at the end of this build, which kind of spoiled a lot of the work I'd done. So it's a model that I'm less than completely happy with, if I'm honest. In fact, I'm pretty disappointed with the finish, and that is also entirely down to, I'm afraid, the decals, which will make me very careful about who I order decals from in the future for my models, and especially my airliners. So I apologise if this episode was a little bit bitty, we should say, but it's sadly, I think it's important that we share the bits of our projects where stuff doesn't go well, as well as the stuff that goes swimmingly. So this just proves that we're all fallible to some degree. And in spite of not being 100% happy with the finished model, I still think it excuse me, I still think it looks nice, and I still think it was a very worthwhile project. And I am enjoying looking at the finished product, but I just wish that certain things had gone better towards the end of the project. They didn't, and so we are kind of left with what we have here. That said, with this out of the way, and hopefully my mojo restored a little bit, we'll get on to another project as soon as I possibly can, as soon as the weather breaks a little bit and it's a little bit cooler. So thanks very much for tuning in, everybody. I'm sorry it didn't quite work out the way we wanted at the end, but I hope you'll agree that in spite of that, it was the project was worth the effort I put into it ultimately. And not everything goes exactly the way you wanted it to. So thanks for tuning in. Take care, everybody, and I will see you very, very soon with the next project, which is a to be revealed. So take care and see you soon.